He lost his dog, his
You
faith,
can rest
and the
now,
will
my
to
friend.
keep living, until the silence of the Himalayas began to whisper his name. This is not a story about death. It's a story about awakening, about a man who walked through war,
Om
grief,
Mani
and
Padme.
ghosts, and found enlightenment in the breath
Om Mani
between
Padme.
mountains. The desert was quieter than it had ever been. Dawn spread a pale silver light over the dunes, and even the wind seemed reluctant to move. Inside the old shipping container, Scout lay near the open door, his breath shallow but peaceful. Jack sat beside him, one hand resting on the dog's ribs, feeling the rise and fall grow slower with each passing minute. Maggie knelt on the other side, her eyes wet but calm, whispering words that were half prayer, half farewell. The smell of candle wax mixed with sand and dry air, a scent that would never leave Jack's memory. When the final breath left Scout's body, the silence became complete. Jack did not cry at first. He simply pressed his palm against the stillness and whispered, "You can rest now, old boy." Maggie placed her hand over his, and for a long time they stayed that way. Three beings joined by love, two living, one just beyond sight. Outside, a single raven called from far away, its voice echoing through the emptiness like a temple bell. They wrapped Scout's body in a plain white cloth and carried him to a small rise behind the container. Jack dug the grave with his own hands, the coarse sand cutting into his palms. Each handful felt like letting go of a piece of himself. When the pit was ready, Maggie laid the leather collar on the mound and whispered, "May you run free." Jack placed the worn rubber ball beside it and closed his eyes. He had buried soldiers before, brothers in war, but this burial felt different. This one was pure. At sunset, they lit incense. The smoke curled upward, blending into the fading gold of the desert sky. Maggie began to chant softly in the language of compassion they had learned months ago from a visiting monk. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find peace. Jack joined her, his voice trembling at first, then steady. For the first time since the war, his prayer did not come from guilt, but from love. That night he dreamed of Scout running across dunes made of light. The collar shone like a halo, and the sand scattered sparks under his paws. When Jack woke, Maggie was sitting in meditation. The candle between them flickering gently though the wind outside roared. "Do you think he's gone?" Jack asked. Maggie opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Nothing ever truly goes," she said. "It only changes form." The next morning, they held a small Buddhist memorial. Maggie read from the Heart Sutra, her voice steady as a mountain stream, while Jack offered water and wildflowers gathered from the valley. When the chant reached, "Gate, gate, paragate," something in him loosened, a knot he hadn't known he still carried. He thought of the monk's words, "Hold your suffering like a crying child." Maybe that was what he was doing now, holding it until it transformed into tenderness. After the ceremony, they sat in silence. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and indifferent. Jack finally said, "I think it's time to leave." Maggie turned to him, surprised. "Leave Nevada?" He nodded. "The desert gave us peace, but it can't give us everything. There's more to learn, teachers to find, mountains to climb." Maggie looked toward the horizon, where the sand met the sky. "Then let's go," she said. "Let's see what waits beyond this silence." That evening they packed the few things they owned: 2 meditation cushions, a small altar statue, Maggie's worn copy of Pieces Every Step, Jack's journal, and Scout's collar. Jack placed the collar carefully between 2 pages filled with sketches of dunes and fragments of prayer. As the sun dropped, painting the world in copper light, Maggie asked, "Where will we go?" Jack unfolded a crumpled map, tracing his finger east across the ocean. "India," he said. "Dharamsala. I want to meet the Dalai Lama. If suffering can be understood anywhere, it must be there." Before dawn, they stood at the container one last time. Jack locked the door, not to protect what was inside, but as a gesture of gratitude, to seal the silence that had sheltered them. The wind rose again, scattering dust that shimmered like ashes from a sacred fire. Maggie whispered a short prayer. Jack could feel the weight of departure in his chest, but beneath it, a quiet excitement stirred, the sense of a road calling. As their truck rolled toward the highway, Maggie looked back. For an instant she thought she saw a shape running alongside them, a flicker of fur, a wagging tail, a brief spark of light. Then it was gone, swallowed by the morning sun. Jack saw it, too. He smiled through his tears. He's leading the way. The road stretched endlessly eastward, ribboning through the desert and beyond. Behind them, the sand reclaimed their footprints. Ahead, the unknown opened like a sacred book, its pages waiting to be read. Jack felt the old fear of change rise inside him. But this time, it no longer controlled him. Pain had once been his prison. Now it would become his teacher. The road into the mountains of Himachal Pradesh wound like a thread through the mist. Jack and Maggie sat in the back of an old taxi that coughed its way up the slopes toward Dharamsala. Around them, clouds moved like slow rivers, wrapping the forest in veils of white. Prayer flags fluttered from pine branches, blue, red, yellow, green, white, each whispering mantras into the wind. Jack pressed his forehead against the window, watching as the world below fell away. "It feels like we're driving into the sky," he said. Maggie smiled. Maybe that's the point. They arrived at noon at a small guest house overlooking the valley. Below them stretched the foothills of the Himalayas, and above, the white peaks pierced the heavens. Bells from the nearby monastery echoed through the air, clear, resonant, like the pulse of the mountain itself. For 2 days, they walked the narrow streets of MacLeod-Ganj, where monks in crimson robes mingled with travelers, seekers, and pilgrims. The scent of butter lamps and juniper smoke lingered everywhere. Jack felt both awe and discomfort. The sacredness pressed on him, but so did his restlessness. On the 3rd morning, they were invited to join a public audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Jack had expected ceremony, guards, distance, but the hall was simple, filled with cushions and morning light. The Dalai Lama entered quietly, smiling as if every soul in the room was a friend he had been waiting for. When his eyes met Jack's, Jack felt something unclench in his chest, a softness he hadn't known he still craved. After the talk, which was on compassion as the root of courage, Maggie encouraged Jack to approach. He hesitated, his palms sweating, but then stepped forward and bowed. "Your Holiness," he said softly, "I've lived most of my life in anger. War, loss, trauma. They've been my teachers, but now I'm afraid I've learned all the wrong lessons." The Dalai Lama regarded him with a gaze both playful and piercing. "Ah," he said, "then you have already learned the first truth, that pain teaches. But tell me, what do you do when pain comes?" "I try to endure it," Jack replied, "or escape it." His Holiness laughed, the sound light and disarming. "That is what most people do, but endurance without understanding is still imprisonment. Escape without awareness is still fear." He leaned closer. Pain is not the wall, my friend. Pain is the doorway. You must walk through it, not around. The words struck Jack like thunder in clear sky. For years he had treated his suffering as an enemy, something to suppress or survive. But now, for the first time, he saw it differently, like an uninvited teacher waiting patiently at the threshold of his mind. "Walk through it," Jack murmured, more to himself than to anyone. The Dalai Lama nodded gently. "Yes. And when you walk, do not walk alone. Compassion is the companion that carries you through. Without compassion, the doorway becomes a wound. With compassion, it becomes awakening." Maggie was quietly crying beside him. The hall seemed to breathe with them, hundreds of strangers united by one truth, that the heart's tenderness is stronger than its pain. Later, outside the monastery, the afternoon sun bathed the mountains in gold. Jack sat on the steps, watching lines of monks chant in the courtyard below. Their voices rose and fell like waves, rhythmic, ancient. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound was not foreign. It felt like something he had forgotten, now returning. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Pain is not an obstacle. It is the threshold of understanding. Suffering held with compassion becomes light." In the following days, Jack and Maggie joined the monks for meditation and meals. The discipline was simple but profound. Wake before dawn, sit in silence, eat mindfully, bow often. Jack found that silence here was not heavy like the desert silence. It was alive, full of breath and subtle sound. One evening a young monk approached him after prayer. "You have soldier eyes," the monk said gently. "They see danger where there is none, but they can also see truth where others cannot. Do not close them." Jack smiled faintly. "How do you live without fear?" The monk looked toward the peaks dissolving into clouds. "We don't. We walk with it. Fear becomes our reminder to stay awake, to stay kind." When Maggie and Jack left Dharamsala 2 weeks later, they carried no relics, only teachings. As the taxi descended the winding road, Jack looked back one last time. The monastery roofs glimmered like red petals against the mist. "Pain is the doorway," he whispered, "and compassion is the key." Maggie squeezed his hand. "Then let's keep walking." The Himalayas faded behind them, but the lesson remained, etched not in thought, but in being. For the first time, Jack did not fear what lay ahead. He understood now that every mountain was both outside and within, and every ascent began in silence. The plain descended through layers of cloud, revealing a valley of brick and dust. Kathmandu shimmered below, a tapestry of prayer flags, rooftops, and golden stupas glinting beneath the sun. The air smelled of smoke, incense, and rain-soaked earth. Jack pressed his face to the window, watching the Himalayas recede behind them like ancient guardians bidding farewell. At first the city overwhelmed them. The streets pulsed with sound, motorbikes, bells chanting, vendors shouting blessings with their wares. Maggie laughed despite herself. "This place doesn't whisper," she said. "It sings." Their guest house was a short walk from Buddhanath, one of the largest stupas in the world. That first evening, they followed the stream of devotees circling clockwise around the immense white dome. Thousands of prayer wheels lined the walls, spinning beneath countless hands. Butter lamps flickered in the dusk, their smoke carrying murmured prayers upward. Jack had never seen such devotion embodied in motion. Old women walked with malas in hand, whispering Om Mani Padme Hum with every breath. Young monks darted through the crowd, laughing softly. Stray dogs dozed beneath the prayer flags. Even the pigeons seemed to fly in rhythm with the chants. "This is meditation, too," Maggie said quietly beside him, not sitting still, but moving with the world. Jack nodded. He felt the pull of something wordless, something older than belief itself. For hours, they walked the circuit again and again. Each rotation felt lighter, as if the act of circling was unwinding some deep knot within him. By the third round, he was no longer counting. By the fifth, he was praying without knowing the words. At the center of the stupa, the eyes of the Buddha gazed down, calm, all-seeing. The painted pupils seemed to follow him, not judging, only witnessing. Jack met that gaze and felt strangely seen, not as a soldier, not as a sinner, but as a being simply trying to understand. The next morning, they climbed the hill to Swayambhunath, the monkey temple. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and candle smoke. Monkeys leapt across the stone balustrades, stealing fruit from offerings while pilgrims laughed. Drums and horns echoed through the air, blending chaos and peace into one sound. From the top, the whole Kathmandu Valley spread beneath them like a living mandala. The wind carried the sound of countless prayers, millions of voices rising, overlapping, dissolving. Maggie closed her eyes, whispering, "It's like the earth itself is chanting." Jack watched her, realizing that her calm had become his compass. Months ago, he would have felt lost in the noise. Now the noise itself was teaching him how to listen. They spent the following days in rhythm with the city's breath. Mornings began at dawn. Tea, silence, then walking meditation along the stupa's base. Maggie kept a small journal of reflections. Jack sketched faces, stupas, clouds. Every page of his notebook smelled faintly of incense. One afternoon, while resting near a row of butter lamps, a young lama sat beside him. The boy couldn't have been older than 12, but his gaze held the stillness of someone far beyond his years. "You are walking many circles," the boy said, "but have you found the center?" Jack hesitated. "I'm not sure I know where it is." The boy smiled. "That's good. But when you think you know, you're already lost. The center cannot be found by walking. It is what you carry when the walking stops." He tapped Jack's chest lightly. "Here." That night, Jack dreamt he was circling an endless stupa beneath a sky full of stars. Each step dissolved into the next, until there was no walker, no path, only movement itself. When he woke, tears lined his face, but his heart was still. Maggie was awake too, sitting by the window, her journal open. "I dreamt of Scout," she said softly. "He was running around the stupa, but every time I reached for him, he vanished into light." Jack smiled. Maybe he's already found the center. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of Kathmandu slowed their pulse. They learned to read silence, even in sound, to see stillness in movement. The city became a teacher, the stupa, a mirror. Before leaving, they offered one final kora around Buddhananath. Dawn painted the dome in gold. Bells rang from unseen corners. Maggie walked with hands folded in prayer. Jack followed, whispering the mantra he had come to love, Om Mani Padme Hum. As they completed the circle, the first rays of sunlight struck the Buddha's eyes. The world felt suspended, like a breath held between in and out. Jack closed his eyes and whispered, "May all beings find their center." Maggie touched his arm. "Ready for the next step?" He nodded. "The road isn't done yet." Behind them, the stupa stood unmoving, eternal, while prayer flags fluttered in the morning wind. For Jack, this wasn't an ending. It was the turning of another wheel, one that had begun long before him and would never stop turning. The road from Kathmandu to Namo Buddha wound through terraced hills and silent villages, the sky above bright yet distant. The further they traveled, the quieter the world became. By the time the taxi reached the base of the monastery hill, the city's noise had vanished, replaced by the whisper of wind through prayer flags. Jack and Maggie began the final ascent on foot. The path climbed steeply between fields of barley and prayer wheels that turned lazily in the breeze. Local children waved as they passed, their laughter echoing against the valley walls. Each breath felt thinner, yet lighter, like the air itself was purified by devotion. When they reached the top, the world opened. The monastery stood at the edge of the clouds, its golden roofs gleaming like small suns. Below, the valley stretched endlessly, a living sea of green. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, but here, everything was still. A monk in saffron robes greeted them with a smile and offered bowls of sweet tea. His eyes, clear as mountain water, seemed to see right through them. "You've come far," he said softly. "Here, even the silence has prayers." Jack and Maggie followed him to the main temple. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and butter lamps. A massive statue of the Buddha filled the hall, serene and radiant. Around its base were paintings depicting the famous Jataka tale, the story of the Buddha's past life as a prince who, moved by compassion, offered his body to a starving tigress and her cubs. Jack stood frozen before the image. The painting was simple, but the eyes of the prince, soft, fearless, pierced something deep within him. He whispered, almost unconsciously, "To give yourself like that, to die for love." The monk beside him said, "Not to die, but to return. Compassion is not sacrifice, it is recognition. The tiger and the prince were never two." Jack turned toward him. "Never two?" The monk smiled. "When compassion becomes pure, there is no giver, no receiver, only the act itself, empty and full at once." The words lingered like incense. Jack felt them settle into him, quiet but undeniable. For years he had mistaken compassion for weakness, a soft emotion unfit for a soldier. Now he saw its true nature, vast, fierce, boundless. They spent the afternoon walking the monastery grounds. Maggie knelt at the shrine, lighting candles for Amy, for Scout, for all beings lost and wandering. Jack sat nearby, watching clouds drift below his feet. The silence here was not empty. It vibrated. Every sound, a bell, a bird, a breath, seemed part of the same prayer. As evening fell, the monks gathered for chanting. Jack and Maggie joined them in the assembly hall. The low, resonant tones of the mantra filled the space, rising like waves through the body. Jack closed his eyes. He saw again the prince feeding the tigress, her hunger dissolving into peace. The image was no longer tragic. It was luminous. Tears streamed down his face, not of sorrow, but release. He understood now. Compassion was not about fixing pain, but embracing it so fully that pain itself transforms. When the chanting ended, the senior monk approached and offered them each a small string of prayer beads. "Keep these," he said. "They remind the heart to return to what it already knows." That night, they stayed in the guest quarters overlooking the valley. The wind sang through the trees, and a pale moon hung low over the mountains. Maggie lay beside him, reading quietly from the heart of Vajrayana. Jack stared at the ceiling, still feeling the mantra in his chest. "Maggie," he said softly, "back in the war I thought courage was about not breaking, but maybe it's about breaking open." She smiled, closing the book. "That's what the Buddha did. He didn't conquer the tiger. He became the love that fed her." They fell silent. Outside, a bell rang once, deep and clear. Before sleep, Jack wrote in his journal, "Today I learned that compassion is not mercy. It is truth. To see the other as yourself, that is the beginning of peace." At dawn, they joined the monks in the courtyard for meditation. Mist drifted between the pines, curling around the temple roofs. When the first light touched the prayer flags, they shimmered like liquid fire. Jack sat still, breathing in the thin air. The mountains seemed to breathe with him. He imagined the tigress, her eyes calm now, her cubs asleep at her side. And somewhere within that ancient story, he found himself, not the warrior, not the penitent, but the witness, learning that love could hold even death without fear. When they finally descended the mountain later that morning, Jack looked back one last time. The monastery floated above the clouds, timeless, as if watching over them. Maggie reached for his hand. "What did you learn up there?" she asked. Jack smiled faintly. That love doesn't end where fear begins. It begins there. They walked down in silence. The wind carried the faint echo of chanting from above, an endless prayer that would follow them wherever they went. The plain to lay seemed to climb endlessly. Through the oval window, the Himalayas stretched beneath them, an ocean of frozen waves, white and silent. When the aircraft descended, Jack felt as if he were landing on the roof of the world. The air was thin, sharp, clean. It smelled of stone and sky. At 11,000 feet, everything slowed. Even breath was an act of prayer. Maggie laughed softly as they stepped onto the tarmac. "It feels like the air itself is meditating," she said. Jack nodded, unable to answer. His chest burned, but his mind was clear. Leh was unlike any place they had been. Monasteries clung to cliffs like nests of light, their white walls streaked with saffron and red. The sky was impossibly wide, so vast it made even thought feel small. Prayer flags stretched between rooftops, snapping in the wind like the breath of invisible beings. They stayed in a guest house, run by monks from Thixi Monastery. Every morning before sunrise, drums echoed through the valley, and horns sounded like ancient wails calling from another world. Jack would wake, step outside, and find the entire horizon painted in gold. One morning they climbed the steep stone path to Hemis Monastery, the largest in Ladakh. The trail wound through desert hills, dotted with white stupas and cairns left by pilgrims. Maggie walked ahead, her pace steady. Jack followed slowly, feeling the altitude press on his lungs. Yet the silence filled him with strength. At the top, the monastery appeared, a fortress of stillness. Inside the main hall, monks sat cross-legged in 2 long rows, chanting from worn scriptures. Their voices blended into one continuous vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Jack and Maggie sat quietly at the back. He felt the chant in his bones more than in his ears. Each syllable seemed to dissolve the boundaries of sound, merging into one deep hum that was neither beginning nor end. During a break, an elderly monk with a face like weathered wood approached them. "You have traveled far," he said, his English slow but precise. "What do you seek?" Jack hesitated. I seek peace." The monk smiled faintly. "Peace is not found. It is remembered. Like the breath. You lose it only when you forget to notice it." They talked outside, beneath a fluttering flag. The monk spoke of impermanence, of how the mountains themselves were changing with every breath of wind. "We mistake stone for permanence," he said, "but even stone is a slow wave." Jack looked at the cliffs around him, realizing for the first time that even this eternal landscape was moving, melting, shifting, breathing. He asked, "And what happens when everything changes?" "Then you see the truth," said the monk. "Nothing can be lost if nothing was ever owned." The words echoed in Jack's heart, like bells in the thin air. For years, he had been haunted by the men he lost, by the life he thought he should have kept. Now he saw the illusion. There was never anything to keep, only to love and let go. In the afternoon, Maggie joined a group of nuns in walking meditation around the courtyard. Jack sat alone by the wall, sketching the prayer flags as they snapped in the wind. Each movement of fabric reminded him of breath, appearing, vanishing, returning. When the evening light fell across the valley, the monks began the fire puja, an offering to purify the mind. Flames rose in the courtyard, their smoke turning orange in the sunset. Jack and Maggie were invited to join. They placed small grains of rice into the fire, while the monks chanted, Oma Hung Vajra Guru Pema Siddhi Hung. As the mantra deepened, Jack felt something unravel inside him. Grief, anger, memory, all dissolving into the rhythm of fire and sound. He realized that he was no longer fighting to heal. He was being healed by the world itself. Later, under the stars, they sat on the rooftop of their guest house. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like a river of diamonds. Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's strange," she whispered. "Up here, even sorrow feels light." Jack smiled. Maybe sorrow was never heavy. Maybe it was us holding it too tightly. They fell silent, watching the stars move, slowly, imperceptibly, over the spires of Thixie. The cold bit at their skin, but their hearts were warm. Before sleep, Jack wrote in his journal, "The sky teaches by being empty. The monks teach by being still. Both say the same thing. You are the space between." The next morning, they visited a small hermitage above the Indus River. A young monk invited them to sit in meditation, facing the snow peaks. The wind howled, fierce but pure. Jack sat still, feeling his body dissolve into the landscape, the pulse of the earth matching the pulse of his blood. For a moment, there was no separation between breath and mountain. When the bell finally rang, he opened his eyes and whispered, "This is it." Maggie smiled beside him. "What is?" "The end of searching," he said, "and the beginning of knowing." As they descended from Ladakh, days later, the sky seemed even larger. The mountains stood unmoving. Yet Jack knew now, they too were changing, moment by moment. And so was he. The flight into Bhutan felt like descending into a dream. Through breaks in the clouds, the emerald valleys appeared, framed by ridges of blue mist and snow-tipped peaks that glimmered like old prayers turned to light. When the plane finally touched down in Paro, Jack felt a stillness so complete it was almost music. Bhutan greeted them not with noise but with quiet grace. Wooden houses painted with mandalas lined the narrow roads. Prayer wheels turned gently in the wind, their soft creak sounding like time itself, breathing. Everywhere there were faces marked not by wealth, but by calm. People walking slowly, eyes bright yet unhurried. At the guest house, Maggie read a framed saying on the wall. "Happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions." She smiled. "So that's the secret, huh?" Jack nodded. "Maybe it's just remembering what matters." Their guide, a young monk named Sonam, led them through Paro Valley. He spoke little, but his silence carried warmth. "In Bhutan," he finally said, "we measure progress not by money, but by compassion. Gross national happiness. But real happiness," he added with a grin, "is not in numbers. It's how lightly you walk." The air was thin and clean. Each breath tasted of pine and incense. As they walked, Jack noticed the prayer flags stretched across bridges. the sound of rivers threading through the valleys like silver veins. Something in him began to loosen. The soldier's vigilance, the endless alertness. 2 days later, they began the climb to Parotaksang, the tiger's nest, Bhutan's most sacred monastery. The path wound up steep cliffs, hemmed by waterfalls and forest. Horses carried supplies ahead. Maggie and Jack climbed slowly, step by step. Sometimes they paused just to breathe. Halfway up, they stopped at a small tea house that overlooked the monastery, a white structure clinging to the sheer rock, floating in clouds. Maggie exhaled in awe. "It looks impossible." Jack smiled faintly. Maybe that's what faith is. When they reached the monastery, bells chimed in the wind. The scent of juniper smoke filled the air. Inside, monks in red robes chanted before golden statues of Guru Rinpoche, the saint who, legend said, had flown here on the back of a tigress. The cave was dark, lit only by butter lamps. Jack bowed his head. The chanting wrapped around him like water, dissolving the last pieces of his resistance. For the first time, he prayed not for strength, but for surrender. He thought of Scout, of Amy, of the faces that still haunted his dreams. "May all beings be free from suffering," he whispered. After the ceremony, Sonam handed each of them a string of mala beads. "When you count these," he said, "don't ask for peace. Ask to understand what keeps you from it." That night, they stayed in a small hermitage overlooking the valley. The air was cool and alive with the hum of crickets. Maggie sat cross-legged, beside Jack, holding her mala. "I think I finally get it," she said. "Happiness isn't about escaping pain. It's about being wide enough to hold it." Jack looked out at the star-lit cliffs. Maybe that's what the Dalai Lama meant. Pain as a doorway. I've spent years trying to seal it shut. Maggie smiled softly. "Now you're learning to walk through." In the morning, Sonam led them to a nearby temple where villagers were offering butter lamps for the deceased. An old woman motioned for Jack to light one. As the flame caught, she pressed her palms together and whispered, "For those who walk before us." Jack felt tears sting his eyes. He realized that in every corner of the world, grief wore the same face. But here, it was softened by love. Later that day, they drove toward Thimphu. Along the way, children waved, monks smiled, and farmers bowed as they passed. Maggie said quietly, "It's strange. No one here seems to hurry, yet everything feels full." Jack nodded. Maybe happiness isn't the absence of struggle. It's when struggle stops being personal. That evening, they visited a monastery perched on a ridge. As the sun sank, hundreds of lamps were lit, each one a small sun against the growing dark. Sonam said, "In our tradition, we light lamps not to banish darkness, but to remember that light has always been there." Jack watched the flames flicker, reflected in Maggie's eyes. "Then maybe the light was in us all along," he murmured. When they returned to their lodging, Maggie found Scout's collar in her pack. She placed it gently on the small altar they carried with them. Jack closed his eyes, feeling a pulse of gratitude rather than pain. "He's still walking," he said, "just on a different path." That night, the wind whispered through the prayer flags. Jack dreamt of Scout running across wide fields of light, pausing once to look back before vanishing into the horizon. When he woke, the first rays of dawn were spilling across the mountains. Maggie stirred beside him. "Another day," she said. Jack smiled. Another chance to walk lightly. Outside, the bells of Parotaksang rang again, echoing through the valley. Each note carried a message older than words. That joy and sorrow were never enemies, only different faces of the same sky. Jack stood in the doorway, hands folded. For the first time he understood. Happiness was not something to reach for. It was what remained when there was nothing left to hold. The first glimpse of Mount Kailash came at dawn. A pale pyramid rising from the world's edge, its summit catching the light before the sun had even touched the plains. Jack stood in the thin air, his breath visible, his heart silent. Maggie whispered, "It looks alive." Jack nodded slowly. Maybe it is. Reaching Kailash was more than travel. It was surrender. The road from Nepal had been long and raw. Dust, altitude, endless sky. Now they stood at the base of what Tibetans called Gang Rinpoche, the precious mountain. For Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, and Bon alike, this was the navel of the universe, the axis of existence itself. They had come not to conquer, but to circle. To Kora, the ancient act of circumambulation. It was said that one full Kora around Kailash could erase the sins of a lifetime. For Jack, it wasn't about absolution anymore. It was about becoming part of something vast enough to forgive everything. The trail began at Darshan, a small windswept settlement at 15,000 feet. The air was thin, biting, holy. Pilgrims moved slowly, prayer wheels spinning, chanting Om Mani Padme Hum. Maggie adjusted her pack. 3 days, she said. 53 kilometers. Jack smiled faintly, and a lifetime between. On the first day, the path wound through the Lachu Valley, following a turquoise river. The mountain loomed ahead like a silent witness. Jack walked in rhythm with his breath. Step, breath, prayer. Around him, Tibetans prostrated on the ground, rising and falling in devotion, measuring the earth with their bodies. Their faith was not performance. It was surrender made visible. That night they camped near Dirapuk Monastery, facing the north face of Kailash. A sheer wall of ice, streaked with light. The temperature dropped below freezing. Maggie built a small fire from yak dung and whispered, "It feels like the mountain is breathing." Jack stared into the flames. Maybe it's breathing us. In the silence he thought of Scout. The image of his old companion came vividly, running along the ridge, turning once to look back. Jack smiled through tears. He made it too, he murmured, while Maggie touched his hand. He never left. The next morning they began the ascent to Dolmala Pass, the highest point of the Kora at nearly 18,600 feet. The air thinned to a whisper. Every step felt like lifting the weight of an entire past life. Maggie stumbled, and Jack steadied her. "We walk for all who can't," he said softly. Halfway up, prayer flags fluttered madly in the wind, thousands of them, tangled and frayed, carrying the names and hopes of countless souls. The path was littered with offerings, coins, hair strands, little stones wrapped in cloth. Jack stopped, touching the frozen earth. Every pilgrim leaves something behind, he thought. Maybe this is where I leave myself. When they reached the summit, the world opened. Sky, snow, silence. The wind roared like the dumb voice of eternity. Maggie wept, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Jack could barely stand, his lungs aflame, yet his mind was clearer than it had ever been. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the ground. "For all I've carried," he whispered, "and for all I could not carry." The moment stretched, timeless. The mountain did not answer. It simply was. And in that stillness, Jack felt the truth unfold. There was no mountain, no pilgrim, no prayer. Only awareness, vast and unbroken, wearing the mask of form. They descended in silence, the wind at their backs. By evening they reached Zutulpuk Monastery, where monks in maroon robes offered them yak butter tea. The drink was thick, salty, and grounding, like the earth itself turned to warmth. As they sat by the small altar, a young monk asked, "What did you find up there?" Jack thought for a moment. "Nothing," he said, "and everything." The monk smiled. "Then you saw the mountain truly." That night, Maggie dreamed of a great wheel turning, fire, water, air, stone, and in its center, Scout's eyes watching her, calm and golden. She woke with tears, but no sorrow. In the morning, as they completed the final stretch back to Darshan, the sun rose behind Kailash, painting its flanks in gold. Jack and Maggie turned for one last look. The mountain shimmered as if alive, and for a moment it seemed to bow, not to them, but to the smallness of human effort, to the vastness of spirit. Jack took Maggie's hand. "I used to think enlightenment was about rising above the world," he said, "but maybe it's about bowing low enough to touch it." She squeezed his hand gently. "Then we've come to the right place." They walked on, each step a prayer, each breath a release. Behind them, Kailash stood eternal, or perhaps ever-changing, its silence now a voice that spoke without words. The path is not to escape the world. The path is to see that you are never separate from it. When they left Tibet, the wind still clung to their clothes, dry, high, sacred. But something inside them had shifted. Kailash had stripped away everything that was not essential. They no longer needed to speak much. Their silence had learned to breathe. They traveled west, not as wanderers, but as pilgrims who no longer sought answers, only presence. The road led them first to France, where the fields were green and soft, and the air heavy with rain. There, among plum trees and simple wooden halls, they found Plum Village, the monastery founded by Thich Nhat Hanh, whose words had once reached their container home in Nevada, like light through dust. The bell of mindfulness rang across the fields, deep and low. Jack paused mid-step as the sound vibrated through his chest. "Breathing in, I arrive. Breathing out, I am home." The monks chanted softly. He realized that after all the miles and all the mountains, he was finally hearing the same silence he had once feared. But now, it was alive, compassionate, and vast. Maggie smiled as she joined the walking meditation. Each step sank into the moist earth, leaving no mark, only awareness. In the dining hall, they ate in silence, a bowl of rice, steamed vegetables, tea. Every sound, the clink of the spoon, the whisper of cloth, felt sacred. After lunch, they met an elderly nun named Sister Mai. Her voice was gentle as she asked, "What brings you here, friends?" Jack smiled faintly. "Silence." She laughed softly. "Then you have come to the right place. But remember, silence is not the absence of noise. It is the fullness of everything." That night, under the plum blossoms, Maggie whispered, "This feels like the desert again, but this time, it doesn't hurt." Jack nodded, because now we know the silence inside us isn't empty. It's love. They stayed a month in Plum Village, sweeping the grounds, attending Dharma talks, practicing mindful breathing with strangers who slowly became brothers and sisters. When they left, the bell followed them in memory, echoing like a heartbeat that would never fade. Their next journey took them to a Maravati monastery in the English countryside, a sea of green hills and rain-soaked sky. Here, Theravada monks in saffron robes walked barefoot along narrow paths and collecting alms from locals who greeted them with quiet reverence. Jack joined the dawn meditation in the great hall. The floor creaked, the candles flickered. The abbot, Ajahn Sumedho, spoke simply. "The mind that seeks enlightenment is itself the obstacle. When you stop searching, you begin to see." Jack closed his eyes. He saw Scout's face, Maggie's smile, the endless deserts, mountains, and oceans they had crossed, all merging into a single moment of stillness. For the first time, he understood what the monk in Ladakh had meant. You are the space between. Maggie, meanwhile, spent her days helping in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, humming softly. One afternoon a nun told her, "Mindfulness is not about doing things slowly, it's about doing them wholly." That evening, Jack and Maggie walked through the wet grass under the twilight sky. "We've been to so many temples," Maggie said, "but they're all teaching the same thing." Jack nodded. "Yes, the path isn't a line, it's a circle, and we've been walking it from the inside all along." From England, they flew to California, where the Pacific roared like a great blue bell. In the hills north of San Francisco, they visited Copan Center, a modern Tibetan monastery built by Western students of the Dharma. There, Western and Eastern practitioners sat side by side, their robes and jeans blending like two rivers into one. Jack joined a weekend retreat led by a teacher from Dharamsala. During one talk, the teacher said, "In the West, people think meditation is escape, but true meditation is confrontation, to sit with your demons until they lose their faces." Jack smiled slightly. "I've met mine," he thought, "and they taught me to bow." In a small closing circle, everyone shared why they had come. A man spoke of grief, a woman of fear. Jack simply said, "I came to stop running." The room fell silent, and for a long moment it felt as though everyone was breathing with him. That night, he and Maggie walked along the Pacific shore. Waves crashed endlessly, each one dying and being born in the same breath. Maggie said softly, "Do you ever think the ocean's just one long exhale?" Jack smiled. "Maybe that's what we are, too." Months later, after many journeys and retreats, they returned to India, drawn by something unfinished, a whisper from the mountains, a promise still waiting. This time, their destination was not grand, not famous. It was a hidden monastery deep in the Zanskar Valley, where few travelers went. Puktal Monastery, carved into the cliffside like a dream suspended between earth and sky. The trek there took days. The trail was narrow, winding above a river that roared far below. Jack's knees ached, Maggie's lips cracked from the cold. But when they finally rounded the last bend, they saw it. The monastery clinging to a cave like a living prayer. The monks welcomed them with butter tea and laughter that echoed off the stone. No one asked who they were, or why they had come. Here, questions dissolved in wind. That evening the head monk, a man with a face both ancient and young, said to them, "You have traveled through many lands, but the real pilgrimage begins when you sit still." Jack bowed deeply. "Then this is where we begin." The next morning they meditated inside the cave, its walls pulsing with centuries of chants. Outside, the river murmured, the wind sang through the prayer flags. Time dissolved. Jack's thoughts fell away like old leaves. There was no desert, no war, no scout, no Jack. Only awareness, infinite and gentle, watching itself. He saw Maggie beside him, her breath calm and steady, her face serene. He saw the flame of the butter lamp flicker, yet never truly go out. And then he saw, not with his eyes but with something wordless, that this, all of it, had never been a journey outward, but a homecoming. When the bell rang, he opened his eyes and whispered, "We made it." Maggie smiled. "We never left." That night, as the wind howled outside and stars crowded the black sky, Jack wrote in his journal for the last time. The desert, the mountain, the ocean. They were all mirrors. The silence I feared was the sound of my own heart awakening. Now I know. There was never a path. There was only this breath, and it was enough. He closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, and lay beside Maggie. Outside, the monastery slept, and in the darkness the universe breathed, slow, vast, and unending. The first snow came silently to Zanskar. Jack woke to the sound of wind moving through the valley like a whispered mantra. The cliffs outside were half veiled in mist, the river below slow and silver. Maggie was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the window, her breath rising in quiet rhythm with the dawn. They had been at Fuktal Monastery for nearly 6 months. The days here were beyond time. Rising before the sun, meditating in the cave where the river's song echoed like memory, eating from simple clay bowls, helping the monks gather wood or spin prayer wheels. The life was sparse, but not empty. Each act, each step, each sound shimmered with the fullness of being. One morning the head monk, Lama Tsering, asked Jack to accompany him up the ridge above the monastery. The path wound through loose stones and patches of snow. The monastery below clung to the cliff like a living hive, its white walls glowing against the ochre rock. At the top, Lama Tsering stopped, pointing toward the horizon where the peaks cut the sky. "Do you see it?" he asked. Jack followed his gaze. "The mountains?" The Lama shook his head. "No, the space between them." They stood in silence for a long time. The wind carried the scent of pine and juniper. Finally, the Lama said, "Most people spend their lives climbing mountains, seeking heights, but enlightenment is not at the peak. It is in the sky that connects them all." Jack felt something shift inside, a quiet recognition, not new, but remembered. "The space between," he murmured. Lama Tsering smiled. "Yes, you have met it before, in silence, in loss, in love. Now let it meet you." The months passed in a rhythm that felt like breath. Jack and Maggie built a small hut a short walk from the main monastery, a retreat cell made of stone and timber, roofed with yak wool. They lived simply, eating barley soup, meditating through dawn and dusk. At night they sat by a butter lamp, reading from the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Each word felt alive, pulsing with warmth. Maggie whispered, "Do you understand it yet?" Jack smiled, not with my head, but maybe with my breath. There were moments of silence so deep that even the sound of snow falling seemed to disappear into it. Jack wrote less and less in his journal. Words no longer seemed to capture anything real. He once wrote, "When the self grows quiet enough, the world speaks in its true voice." One evening, while walking along the frozen river, they met a group of children from the nearby village carrying small butter lamps. The oldest girl explained, "Tonight we offer light for those who have no light." Maggie bent down, smiling. "And who has no light?" The girl giggled. "Those who forget they are light." Jack stood still as the children placed their lamps on the ice. The flames trembled, reflected endlessly in the black water. He felt tears on his cheeks. But they were not of sadness. They were of recognition. In late winter, Maggie fell ill with fever. The monks cared for her with herbs and warmth. Jack stayed by her side day and night, wiping her forehead, whispering prayers. At one point she looked at him, eyes soft but clear. "Jack," she said, "if I go first, promise me you'll stay." He shook his head, voice trembling. "We've come this far together." She smiled faintly. "We've always been together, even before we met." Her fever broke after 3 days. The morning she woke, The first sunlight spilled across their room. Jack sat beside her, holding her hand, unable to speak. She whispered, "See, even impermanence is kind." That evening they joined the monks in chanting. The air vibrated with deep, resonant tones. Jack closed his eyes and felt Scout beside him, wagging his tail in joy. He felt the desert wind of Nevada, the bells of Paro, the snow of Kailash, all merging in a single breath. He realized that life had never been a straight path, but a spiral, each return deeper, each silence more luminous. Spring arrived like a gentle confession. The cliffs bled green and the river roared with meltwater. Birds nested among the prayer flags. Jack spent his mornings helping repair the monastery walls. Maggie tended the small vegetable patch. In the evenings, they meditated outside, facing the western sky that glowed gold before fading into indigo. One dusk, Maggie said, "Do you remember what Lama Sering told us? That space is the real teacher?" Jack nodded. "I think I finally understand," she continued. "We spend our lives trying to fill the space. With noise, with thought, with fear. But when we stop fighting it, space becomes love." Jack smiled. "You sound like him now." She laughed softly. "Maybe we all do, eventually." They fell silent. The world seemed to breathe around them. The wind, the birds, the distant chant of monks, all one pulse. Jack realized there was no separation anymore between the desert, the mountain, or the heart. The pilgrimage had ended, but the path went on. Inward, infinite. On the final night before summer rains, Lama Tsering visited their hut. He brought 2 white scarves, katas, and draped them around their shoulders. "You have walked well," he said. "Now walk less." Jack bowed deeply. "What happens now?" The Lama smiled. "Nothing and everything. When a candle finishes burning, its light does not end. It becomes part of the dawn." Later that night, Jack and Maggie sat by the river. The moon was full, casting the monastery in silver. Maggie leaned against him. "Do you think we'll ever leave?" Jack shook his head gently. "We already have, in every way that mattered. And yet, we're finally home." They watched the river flow, carrying petals and prayer flags torn loose by the wind. Jack thought of all the journeys, the grief, the fear, the faces, the laughter, all dissolving into this single, wordless peace. He whispered, "Maybe the purpose of pain wasn't to break us, but to open us wide enough to hold the whole sky." Maggie smiled, eyes glistening. "Then, Jack, we finally found it. The stillness that moves." Above them, the stars shimmered like silent prayers. The wind brushed their faces, cold and kind. Somewhere within the mountain, the ancient chant continued, unbroken, a song of those who had walked before and those yet to come. Jack closed his eyes, his hand resting on Maggie's, and for the first time in all his lives, he felt not healed, not enlightened, just whole. It was said that at Foktal time did not move. It breathed. Months turned like prayer wheels in the wind. The world outside shifted, but for Jack and Maggie, life had settled into the pulse of the monastery. Dawn bells, meditation, silence, the steady rhythm of breath. The valley of Zanskar had entered its brief summer. Wildflowers painted the cliffs, and the river ran free again, silver as the mind after rain. The monks repaired the old bridges. Children carried yak milk to the kitchens. Prayer flags faded under the sun, their colors returning to the wind that once gave them life. Jack and Maggie had grown older. Lines around their eyes deepened not from worry, but from smiling. Their days began with the soft clang of a gong, and ended with stars reflected on the river like unspoken prayers. They had stopped seeking. they had become. One morning, Jack walked alone to the upper ridge where Lama Tsering had once spoken about the space between mountains. The air was thin, trembling with light. Below him, the monastery clung to the cliff like a dream refusing to fade. He sat down on the cold stone and closed his eyes. There was no mantra, no effort, no search, only the sound of his breath merging with the wind. In that stillness, something shifted. Or perhaps something simply revealed itself. He saw Scout again, running through the Nevada desert, tail wagging in endless joy. He saw Amy, smiling under the August sun of 1978. He saw the soldiers, his brothers, their faces no longer twisted in pain, but lit with peace. And then he saw Maggie, standing by the river, her scarf fluttering like a prayer flag, her eyes full of sky. Tears welled up, not of sorrow, but of recognition. Every being, every loss, every journey, all of it had been the same path, leading home. When he opened his eyes, the sky stretched infinite. There were no more questions, no more edges. He whispered softly, "Silence has finally become home." That evening, Maggie found him sitting outside their hut, a gentle smile on his face. "You were gone long," she said, "just watching the world breathe." He replied. They sat together, watching the twilight sink over the monastery. The bells began to ring for evening prayers. Maggie rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jack chuckled. "Leaving where? There's nowhere else." The monks began chanting. The sound rolled down the cliffs like thunder softened by mercy. Jack closed his eyes, letting the vibration move through his chest. Each syllable seemed to carry not words, but the pulse of existence itself. When the chanting ended, Maggie whispered, "Do you remember what the Dalai Lama said in Dharamsala? Pain is the doorway, not the wall." Jack nodded slowly, "And we walked through it." "Yes," she said, "and look what was waiting on the other side." They both smiled. The world had become so still that even the silence felt like music. The following days flowed seamlessly. Meditation, meals, tending the garden, sharing laughter with young novices. Jack sometimes taught English to the children. Maggie helped translate Buddhist texts with the elder nuns. Every act, no matter how simple, carried the same quiet devotion. One night, a novice asked Jack, "Sir, do you ever miss your old life?" Jack thought for a moment, gazing into the butter lamp's flickering light. "I used to think life was something I could lose," he said. "Now I see. Life never leaves. It just changes form, like fire becoming light." The boy frowned, trying to understand. Jack smiled gently. "One day, you'll see it, too." When autumn returned, the air grew sharp again. The monks prepared for retreat season, long days of meditation, silence, and snow. Jack and Maggie decided to remain through the winter, their final retreat together. Snow began to fall early that year. The world turned white, soundless. Inside the hut, they lit their butter lamps and sat in meditation side by side. Sometimes Maggie would open her eyes and see Jack still as a statue, breath so faint it barely stirred the air. He seemed to dissolve into the silence around him, or perhaps the silence had taken his shape. One night, the moon rose full and blue. Maggie woke and found Jack sitting upright, eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. She touched his shoulder. "Jack?" He did not stir. His breath had stopped, but his peace filled the room like light spilling through the door. Maggie knelt beside him. Tears came, but they were calm, warm. She whispered, "You made it home." She sat in silence until dawn. The river below murmured softly, as if whispering a prayer. The next morning, the monks carried Jack's body to the edge of the cliff. Lama Tsering led the ritual, prayers rising like smoke into the cold air. Maggie placed a white kata over Jack's folded hands. "May your breath become the wind that guides others," she said. When the ceremony ended, Lama Tsering turned to her. "He is not gone," he said gently. "He has become what he sought." Maggie bowed deeply, tears in her eyes. "And I will keep walking until silence welcomes me too." That evening she sat by the river with Scout's old collar in her hand, now faded and frayed. She smiled softly. "We're all together again, just not the way I expected." As the sun disappeared behind the peaks, the entire valley seemed to hum. Wind, water, prayer wheels, all breathing in unison. Maggie whispered, "Everything changes. Nothing is lost." The stars emerged, countless and quiet, and somewhere within that infinite stillness Jack's laughter echoed, not from above, not from beyond, but from within the vast, eternal space that holds everything. Silence had indeed become home. Silence is never empty. It carries the weight of every word unsaid, every heartbeat uncounted, every prayer that never reached the lips. It is not absence. It is the space where presence is born. For Jack Turner, silence began as punishment. In the desert of Nevada, it was a mirror too sharp, reflecting his war, his ghosts, his guilt. He ran from it, filled it with noise, guns, memories, fears. Yet no matter how far he went, silence followed like a shadow that refused to be left behind. But what he didn't know then was this. Silence had not come to haunt him. It had come to heal him. Through Maggie, through Scout, through the teachings of monks and masters, silence began to change shape. It stopped being a wall and became a doorway, a teacher, a companion. He learned that silence is not the opposite of sound. It is the womb from which sound is born, not the absence of meaning, but its source. In Dharamsala he met compassion. In Kathmandu he met faith. In Namo Buddha he met sacrifice. In Ladakh he met impermanence. In Bhutan he met happiness. In Kailash he surrendered. In Phuktal he met the vast, unbroken field of being, where even breath seemed too loud to disturb the stillness that held everything. And there, silence became not what surrounded him, but what he was. Jack's journey was not unique. It was every soul's pilgrimage, the path from sound to stillness, from noise to knowing, from fear to freedom. He had not escaped life. He had entered it fully, until even death was not an ending, but another deep inhale before the next beginning. Silence became his teacher, his home, his truth. But it was Maggie who gave it meaning. For silence, shared, is love, and love, held in silence, is eternity. After Jack's passing, Maggie continued to live at Phuktal for many years. She became a guide for travelers who came seeking peace. They found her sitting by the river most days, eyes half closed, listening, not to the sound of water, but to the silence beneath it. Sometimes, when the wind passed, it carried a laugh, faint, familiar, as if the mountain itself remembered. One day when a young pilgrim asked her, "What did you find after all those years?" She smiled softly. "Nothing," she said, and in that nothing, everything. Silence, after all, is not an escape from the world. It is the world unveiled. The noise of cities, the cries of children, the rush of wind, all are waves within a greater stillness. The more deeply one listens, the more the boundary between inside and outside dissolves. To hear silence is to remember that you and the universe have always been the same breath, inhaling and exhaling each other across eternity. Jack's story ends, but the silence he found does not. It continues in every reader who pauses, in every listener who feels rather than speaks, in every act of compassion born from stillness. For silence is not the end of sound. It is the sound of understanding. It is the voice of life itself, whispering through all things. You are never alone. You are always home. If this story spoke to you, if you felt the wind of the desert, the echo of Jack's silence, or the heartbeat of something greater within you, don't let it end here. Stories like this are not just meant to be heard. They're meant to be continued in your reflection, your breath, your compassion. So before you go, take a moment. Breathe. And if this journey touched something real in you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share what part of Jack's path stayed with you. Every voice, every story, every listener keeps this flame alive. And your presence here helps it reach others who may still be searching for their own silence. Thank you for walking this path with us. The next story begins soon, and perhaps it's already waiting within you. Until then, may you walk gently, breathe deeply, and find your own stillness.